I've noticed when people say they love Streets of Rage, they often mean Streets of Rage 2. Not surprising, as it's one of, if not the most beloved beat 'em up on the Genesis of the 16-bit era, and in the genre as a whole as it exists on a 2D plane. While I share this appreciation of the second game, my core fandom actually lies with the first entry. Likewise, there are diehards who believe the third game to be the best, whether by technical, artistic, or nostalgic merits. Point is, Streets of Rage fans feel a deep attachment to the series, but there's always one that stands out, one that connects more. Despite their similarities and continuity, each game is more varied in style than we tend to acknowledge, presenting its own unique pantomime of violence, mania, and endurance, unlike the last. Some of these differences are based solely in tone, while others may be more subjective, based in a memory of camaraderie playing with a friend, or a late-night session coated in the flickering glow of a TV screen. The following are my reflections on the feel of each game, and my musings on their auras. While the Genesis fulfilled its promise of bringing the arcade experience home, it wasn't strictly an arcade machine. Streets of Rage is an interesting anomaly in that while built like an arcade game, it was made specifically for the Genesis, not being a home conversion. Unlike its contemporaries, Streets of Rage starts with no flashy attract screen. Instead, the game opens with a city skyline, a solemn score orchestrating the role of text. Captured by the gentle flickering of amber and blue lights, the player is invited into a dangerous nocturnal world, one perhaps not so unlike their own. A city taken over by crime, its last hope is three renegade cops looking to topple a criminal syndicate by brute force. The plan is risky as it is straightforward, the player feeling the weight, but also the hope, of Blaze, Adam, and Axel's plight as a break comes to the paragraph, the song beginning to swell as the words Streets of Rage come into view. While Streets of Rage isn't exactly a narrative adventure, its opening proves immersive in spite of its simplicity, feeling as though it has more of a story than it actually does. Players start on the streets, scrapping with punks before moving to a beach, the docks, ferry, factory, and eventually into the high-rise housing the syndicate leadership. As the sun rises, light piercing the windows of the penthouse, the 30 to 40 minutes you've spent playing suddenly feel like a full night of fighting in the streets, the rising sun ushering in a new era for the city. While many of the backdrops repeat with only slight variations throughout the stage, Koshiro's score gives each alleyway, avenue, and corridor a cinematic reveal. The music is outstanding on its own, but its implementation and progression plays a big part in achieving immersion. More than any visual cue, the music is what ushers players onward. It's all, for lack of a better term, grounded. Sure, the task of taking out a literal army of criminals in a series of consecutive fistfights pushes the limits of reality. Streets of Rage is a power fantasy, but part of its resonance and immersion are born of the fact its places and characters more or less resemble reality. No, I've never seen a clown juggling knives or torches in the street, nor have I ever seen police use a napalm launcher. But flair is different from fantasy. Streets of Rage wasn't about superheroes, rather it was about regular people rising to the call of an extraordinary circumstance. Streets of Rage 2 pushed things a little bit farther. Once again, the game opens with Koshiro's iconic hymn, now with screeching guitar-like shreds and the pulsating, glowing hands of Mr. X floating over the city, evil threatening to seize control once more. The fight becomes personal with Adam kidnapped, Blaze and Adam recruiting help to take the fight to the streets. Streets of Rage 2 makes a hell of a first impression. The backgrounds are detailed, bright, and full of movement. Character models are bigger and more detailed, and the camera is zoomed in to better capture the action on screen. Thrashing her way through the first wave of thugs, the avenue takes a detour right, previewing how the game is set up to be a genuine set of actual streets, lending the city a fuller, three-dimensional build. The first few stages of Streets of Rage 2 feel familiar enough, but as the game progresses, reality begins to warp. Streets of Rage 2 lies somewhere between action and science fiction. Whereas in the first game you fought punks and martial artists running amok in the streets, in Streets of Rage 2 you go beneath and away from the streets entirely. The gang members aren't just fighters, they're animal trainers and cyborgs, some even wear jetpacks. Luckily, Axel and company are equipped to combat this new breed of high-tech punk with supernatural energy attacks and crowd-dispersing furies in place of police backup. Streets Rage 2 upped the ante and aligned itself with its contemporaries in the genre. Its style, setting, and features are lifted from popular franchises of the era like Street Fighter and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's still a little dark and a little violent, but it feels less dramatic and more spectacular, oozing 90s marketability. The fact it adopted a new look and feel without losing its identity entirely is a noteworthy feat. However, it cannot be denied it carries a different tone from the first. It's almost like the original TMNT comic versus the TV show. Both are good, and part of the audience is shared, but part of it also isn't. In extending its reach, it also lost hold of what it had initially grasped. It became a game of action figures instead of what the figures were supposed to represent. The city panorama replaced by a handwritten note and narration replaced by Blaze's accounts of the conflict, Streets Rage 3 begins by boldly framing its setup through the actual voices of its characters. The title screen too sets it apart from its predecessors, the black background of the menu screen replaced by a stark concrete surface decorated with blood splatter. Streets Rage 3 is not subtle in its beginnings. It doesn't start on a random street, the player tasked with taking out low-level thugs. Instead, it begins halfway through an action sequence, the player immediately tasked with storming a warehouse. Enemies attack from the front, back, and above. Reinforcements jump out of boats, armed guards cover the warehouse door, and Mr. X's left-hand man awaits on the dock, bent on stopping our heroes before they can even begin. Furthermore, Streets Rage 3 starts not at night, but during the day. This is no covert affair. There's now open fighting in the streets in broad daylight. Streets Rage 3 builds an alternative 90s cyberpunk city with flesh and steel colliding in wholly new and dangerous ways. More importantly, however, it commits to its cyberpunk setting instead of simply incorporating popular video game and comic book tropes for the sake of variety. This cutting-edge, burning chrome world is matched by some of the highest fidelity visuals on the Genesis, backed up by a highly experimental soundtrack. The hard-hitting techno sounds like something from the future while still maintaining that Streets Rage cool. Like the faster, revamped fighting, the soundtrack has evolved to better score the chaos on screen. Visual touches like strobe effects, background events, and even dancing animations do more than just show off the Genesis's power. Streets Rage 3's environments bring the city to life by a series of set-piece moments, making the journey feel less left to right and more investigative and open by proxy. While the first game mirrored a renegade cop action movie and the second 90s comic book and cartoon variety, the third game is so great because it embraces the video game medium itself. It pushes its hardware to the limit, rewriting what kind of audio and visual experience one could expect of a 16-bit video game, while also delivering the type of narrative the maturing Sega audience was coming to expect. It feels heavy, mechanical, and robust, like a machine built to emulate brawling power fantasies in the most visceral way it could. Activator incorporation aside. The Streets Rage games are a gradient of continuity cut from the same cloth, but all of varying shades. I like them all for different reasons, though the original fight through the streets is the one I love most. The fourth game too has proven to have its own unique feel while maintaining series traditions. It's violent and sexy, but not afraid to be appropriately silly when called for. It's a game aimed at fans while not being afraid to write its own story instead of retelling an old one. Like the third game, it has matured with its audience, while still being accessible for new players looking to enter the city of eternal danger. How do you feel about the franchise? Do you agree with my interpretations, or do the Streets Rage games bleed a different gradient for you?